which I think is 3 library remodels here, which is just extraordinary. I didn't expect that. I came from a library from Connersville, Indiana. If you know where Connersville is, out on the eastern side, we had just built a new library. They actually, I guess we tore down an old Carnegie, which was not a good thing to do, but it truly was in horrible shape. It was, I know that the librarian at the time that I worked under brought in architects, and they said, well, you know, you can spend oodles of money and you're going to end up with an old building that is falling apart anyway. So that said, it's a beautiful building. And I am fascinated that that building, which was, we opened it in 1980, and you can still see the original carpet from, so if you want to see really wild, at least the last time I was there, if you want to see really wild late 1970s carpet, it truly is orange and brown. Those are the 2 predominant colors. It is your library to go see. But we're going to talk about the West Lafayette Public Library. And I wonder if I click, no, how do I get to, I got it.
Basically do this.
Oh, use that one.
We'll
Okay.
do that, and then
Gotcha.
you'll hang on. I got to click on to your thing there, and that starts you going. So
Excellent.
if you want to move back one,
Yeah, I do, but that's okay. That's great. Thank you.
it's like the wrong controller.
Yes. Did she put the, oh, yes, thank you.
Technology, huh?
You know, I have teacher training when I was in college, and we had to take an AV course for teacher training. So it still doesn't come naturally to me, but that's okay. So I thought I'd start by asking, what is a public library? In library land, there are public libraries, there are academic libraries, there are school libraries, and there are special libraries. And we all try to figure out what in the world a special library is, but be that as it may. What is a library? A library board member recently, like this week, sent this to me, and I thought that it's a little cheeky, but I like it. This is a library, crossroads of civilization, refuge of all the arts against the ravages of time, armory of fearless truth against whispering rumor, incessant trumpet of trade. From this place, words may fly abroad, not to persist as digital waves, but find in time, not corrupted by the hurrying hand, but venerated in proof, verified in proof. Friend, you stand on sacred ground. This is a library. It sounds almost like something from Saturday Night Live, but this is a wonderful, I think, statement of what a library ought to be. And we are special in Tippecanoe County because we have several great libraries. Purdue Libraries being perhaps the biggest and best known, but certainly our friends at TCPL just up the street from here, and the West Lafayette Library, which started in the 1920s. And some of you have heard me talk about the 1920s before, and I'll beg your patience for just a moment as I kind of review my fascination with the 1920s locally. We know that Greater Lafayette Tippecanoe County had been through a lot of struggle, a lot of changes just before that. The flood, just before World War I, then World War I itself, and then the Spanish flu, the so-called Spanish flu, which, having gone through COVID, has new meaning to me. I understand now why people wanted to get past all of that stuff, and why in the 1920s Harding won with a "let's get back to normalcy" theme. It makes way more sense to me now that I've lived through that period myself. So 1920s. What is happening in Greater Lafayette, in West Lafayette in particular? Several momentous events. The League of Women Voters is founded, which of course is because women could vote. And League of Women Voters now becomes an active civic participant in Greater Lafayette. They look around, and one can imagine them saying, well, you know, there's this new radio station thingy over at Purdue University, W something or other. WBAA dates back to the very early 20s. There's a new fire station. West Lafayette was behind, not surprisingly, right? West Lafayette, as usual, is a little behind Lafayette in terms of getting with the program back in the day, especially because in the olden days, and we have a copy of the fire station history here, and I know that TCHA does too. It's fascinating reading. West Lafayette decides, well, we can't keep calling fire brigades over from Lafayette because it takes too long. Stuff is burning down and we don't have a really good way of responding to it. So West Lafayette starts a fire department. They build a building that was constructed in 1894, I believe. We can all check my math on that. And it is on North Chauncey, which at the time was called Main Street in West Lafayette, because that was the main thoroughfare. By 1920, the fire station is getting too small. So they build a new fire station a couple blocks up on North Street, still there. It's fire station number 1, it's where the fire chief is. And I know they're very, very proud of how they have remodeled that maybe 20 years ago, 15, 20 years ago. So that is built. And the League of Women Voters is saying, well, you know, what don't we have in West Lafayette? We don't have a public library. We have a really good school. We have Morton School. We have Oakwood High School, but we don't have a public library. What are we going to do about that? People were coming over here and using the old Wells, like well, it was kind of old by then, wasn't it? Probably 40 years old by then. They were using the Wells Public Library, which was great, but they wanted something in West Lafayette. So lo and behold, they decide, well, let's see if we can't get a public library going here. So the League of Women Voters takes it on themselves. They make it their project and they develop a public library for West Lafayette. Interestingly, they don't know where they're going to put it yet, which I find very optimistic on their part. They do know they want a public library. They go to the state and they find out how you appoint how a library board gets appointed. And they make sure that there are indeed library board people in place. They start meeting in the local high school, beginning a very long and fruitful relationship between the library and the West Lafayette schools. And there is rumor going about that, you know, that there's that old municipal building, which isn't all that old really, right? By that time. A little look at West Lafayette in the early 1900s. This is a TCHA photo. Thank you all very much. This does look about 1905. Harry's is a little bit later, but this gives you an idea of what West Lafayette would have looked like in the 1920s. The Miller building, which is still there, thank goodness, was a grocery back then. Morton School is up there in the upper right-hand corner as you're looking at it. It was a bustling little town. Having a public library made a lot of sense to folks. And so this is a plaque that has been posted just this summer. The West Lafayette Civic Center, the building at 115 North Chauncey, Main Street until 1941. And it talks about being constructed in 1885, it was off by a little bit. Both the West Lafayette Fire Department and the Town Hall until 1917, when Fire Station number 1 was built at North and Northwestern. In 23, it became home to the West Lafayette's fledgling public library, love that wording, with 825 volumes. Going to talk about that in a moment. Library left the building in 1961, is replaced by the West Lafayette Police Department from 63 to 69. And since then, the building has been privately held, but for 70 years, it served as a hub of civic life. And thank goodness it is still there as well. So in 1921, the library board, as it was set up, decided two things. Number one, we need a place for this actual public library. They discovered that that building was, and I think it's on my next slide. Oh, a picture of the fire department. And as Jeff mentioned, thank you very much again. This is the old Baptist church that the library board did, and you weren't on the board yet, so you escape any culpability. The library board did take that building down. We have kept a number of the windows, and you'll be able to see them on display before too horribly long. It was a grand old building. It was in horribly decrepit shape, but it was a grand old building. And obviously, the fire department was happy to be filmed in front of it. Back in the day when you had horses pulling here. And a little quick anecdote to wander around here. How many of you remember Lucille Washburn, my predecessor? Or if you don't remember Lucille, she was a wonderful gal. First MLS librarian, Master of Library Science in West Lafayette. She told me that in the old building, which would have, been down the street just a little bit, where she worked for several years until the new building was built. She said there were days, especially in the summer, when you could tell they used to stable horses here. And I figured, okay, that's a nice way of putting it. So evidently, once you have horses, you always have horses. They don't necessarily go away totally. I just thought that was wonderful.
Is that the Methodist in the, was that two churches and the old Methodist on the right and the?
The Methodist would have been over here.
Oh, I see.
Yeah,
So
across the
that
street.
whole thing is the Baptist. That was.
Yeah. This was the Baptist church, and then it became they became Federated Church, moved up the road a little bit, and then it became the Episcopal Student Church. And goodness knows how they funded it because it's huge. It was huge, right? And then they sold it to GTE, who wanted to use it for a phone station. And GTE, we don't know why. Rumor was when I got there that GTE didn't considered it a hot potato and they didn't want to deal with it anymore. So they sold it to the library board. And the library board said, oh, sure, we'll take that on. And
So what is there now in that, for that building?
where this is now is the parking garage for the West Lafayette Library. It's had a lot of, but it's still, it's still public civic use, if you want to look at it that way. This whole area from Salisbury Street on Morton up to Northwestern has been civic use for a long, long time. It's changed over the times, and calling a church a civic use is maybe, but it wasn't a retail commercial environment. So the library board gets together, they decide how are we going to even fund this thing, much less get it going off the ground. They decide they're going to have a subscription library, which dates way back, as you may know, back to the Ben Franklin days. That's how you got your library together. There's still, in my home, the town where I grew up, Cincinnati, still has a subscription library downtown. So it's still a possible thing. Anyway, they decided they would take subscriptions from members of the community. They basically talked with you. I'm sure they didn't call you up because it would have been much easier to just talk to you face to face. And they wrote down, you could look in the old board minutes and you can see who was supposed to pay. The Clinks were gonna pay $25, and you could pay it off over time. You could pay it all at once. You could pay it down over time. People, the Shooks are mentioned in there, the Lommels are mentioned in there, the Birchfields are mentioned in there, the Wileys are mentioned in there, the Knapps are listed in there. It's interesting to look through that list. And there are lots of names I don't know, but there are certainly people that you go, oh, okay. And you can see how much they pledged and how they were paying. And just another wonderful little anecdote, as you go through the board minutes, which is really fun to do, if you're into that kind of history. There is a moment in time about 2 years into the pledge drive where people are being not everybody's paying up, right? Some people started out well, and then over time it kind of, and so the board, there's this controversy on the board, Jeffrey, about what should we do with these people? Somebody actually wants to sue them. They're voted down. And instead of suing them, they say, well, let's write a nice letter and say, hey, we noticed you haven't paid your pledge yet. Would you mind? And it eventually, I take it that either everybody paid up or they just wrote some off as bad debt, because eventually the topic goes away. But I thought that was so. In 1923, reported on delinquents and recommended that suit be brought against those who have failed to respond to notices sent to them. Mrs. Price, I'll use her name, moved to write a friendly letter to send to those who have paid part of their subscriptions, and that we should see those who have not responded before further action is taken. The motion was properly seconded and passed. Yay. So suit avoided. The library board knows that they need a library. This is 1921-22. They put the word out across the great state of Indiana. they get folks to apply. They're all women, as far as I can tell from reading the minutes. Women apply from around the state, from Boswell, from Otterburn, from Crawfordsville, from places that nowadays you would say, well, that's really interesting. They select Mrs. Eva Dickey. This is a wonderful portrait of her. I think she's sitting in the library. Notice the catalog, notice the circulation cards. This goes, I bet most, not all of us, well, you may even remember that. I don't know. Did you have the little pull-out cards and they stamp the date? And so there's Mrs. Dickey. I find her fascinating for many reasons. First librarian, she served until 1941 when she retires. And she was not their first choice. And this is all in the minutes, which is almost a little scary. They bring her in, they interview several people, they offer the job to one person. She says, no, I don't think I want this. So they go to Mrs. Dickey, interview her, offer her the job at less than they had originally budgeted. Interestingly enough, they had budgeted $75 a month for the librarian. They offer Mrs. Dickey $50 a month. Again, it's all in the minutes. And she says yes. And so they hire her in at $50 a month to run the library. The very early minutes are wonderful because she is basically the librarian in charge of the whole library, which is on the second floor of the city building. And she is responsible for banking the coals in the evening and starting them up again in the morning, and checking people in, checking people out. The hours are 1 until 6, Monday through Saturday, 1 until 6, then closed and then open again 7 till 9. And basically Mrs. Dickey is doing that. She eventually does get an assistant who helps out with some of this stuff. They have a janitor who comes in and does janitorial kind of things, but basically Mrs. Dickey is the library for West Lafayette. And they send her to library school, which I would love to. There was a summer library school in Indianapolis. So they send Mrs. Dickey to summer library school. She evidently is a star pupil, comes back. The next year, they up her salary by 50%, give her the $75 that they had originally planned for the position. So Mrs. Dickey obviously did something right. She obviously impressed them. When the library opens in 1922, in the spring of 22, we start with books. And I brought just a few here that probably would have been in the collection at the time. George Bar McCutcheon, this is one of his Graustark novels, Truxton King, A Story of Graustark. Local author, right? Part of the Indiana Renaissance. And this is actually cataloged in our collection. It is now in our archives that Devin is responsible for, because it's not in the kind of shape where you really want people riffling through it regularly. George Ade's book. I brought this because of Andy. Evelyn Stein with her book of poetry for kids. And it is, it's wonderful. Couldn't not bring The Old Gal of Mine by James Whitcomb Riley. So the library opens. We also discover that the library is going to have an encyclopedia. I'm guessing they got Britannica, so I brought a Britannica. It's not quite clear in the minutes what it was. And they had magazines. Very, very early. One of the first things they do is bring in books. They bring in magazines, and they bring in kids' books, and they distinguish between all of those. So I brought some Life magazine. This Life magazine is from 1936, and the National Geographic is even older. It is from 1923. So this could very well have been on the shelves when the library opened. I'll point out that these are bound volumes, and those of you who go back in time a little bit will remember that they would have been loose volumes, and you would have read them, the newer ones, and then the older ones. Once you got a years, you would send them off to Heckman Bindery up in North Manchester and get them bound. And that's what we have today, are the bound volumes. Anyway, fascinating to me that the library opens with books, magazines for adults and kids, and the construction of a magazine rack, a newspaper rack, was ordered after proper design was received from the Library Commission in Indianapolis, which is like cool. So the state library even then was an important part in public library services. Children's services has been key since the get-go. On June 4th of 1923, after some discussion as to the need of juvenile books, it was moved, seconded, and passed that $100 worth of juvenile books be purchased at once, which is like a lot of money back in the early 1920s. So they were taking children very seriously. And this is all happening under Mrs. Dickey's watch and happening on the second floor of the public library, right? In fact, by December of 1924, Mrs. Dickey asks that she, in cooperation with the book committee, be permitted to make Xmas holiday season enjoyable for children who come to the library. They authorized, the board authorized the expenditure of money not to exceed $10 for decorations. So at least in 1924, the kids got a special Xmas, and it's Xmas in the minutes, not Christmas, it's Xmas. In September of 1923, we move into a very early statement that the public library will be open for everyone. The board actually passes a resolution saying that no charge will be implemented for anyone who is out of district, who is outside of the West Lafayette Library District. Everyone is welcome to use the library at no charge, something that continues to this day, which is fascinating to me. So very early, the library invests in books, it invests in magazines, and it invests in technology. One of the first things they do, in addition to ordering books and magazines, is what? They order a phone. Kind of makes me wonder what wasn't there. But they order a phone for the library. So very, very early, the building gets a phone. Technology is on its way. And we'll be talking just a bit more about that shortly. It's also fascinating, I think, to look at the library and say, well, what were they thinking of in terms of the future of the library? Sure, you just opened it. People are coming in and using it, and things seem to be bubbling along. It's the 1920s. Things are really happening in West Lafayette, right? It's slowly growing and enlarging, and Purdue is continuing to show that a Midwest university can make a go of it. As early as 1923, there's discussion, or there's note in the board that they had discovered that a new tract in not too far away was going to become open. It was Reserve Square. So it's where the Sullivan Bank area is. There was a tract there that was opening up in 1923, and the board, in their minutes, said that they would look to see if that tract could be secured for West Lafayette and made into a beauty spot, which meant a library and appropriate landscaping and outdoor facilities. So very early, they realized this is a nice building. It's not purpose-built as a library, but it's making do. But let's look around and see if we can't get something else going in the community. Something that will obviously, as we all know, will take root and blossom a little bit later as the decades roll by. And finally, I wanted to mention Purdue. I mentioned WBAA. It's not clear that the library had any direct programming influence. Unless Sheila Klinker came over and got children's books to read on her children's story hour. I don't know that happened. Do you know if that happened? Does she? Let's just say that was possible. But we do know that Purdue University provided quite a number of the board members for the library board over the years, starting from the very first board and going forward. So there was already that connection going on between Purdue and the library. Obviously, we were having Purdue students, faculty, staff coming in and using the library. That was largely the population of West Lafayette at the time, right? And if you look back, you can see some of the names, the big names at Purdue are associated with the library from very early on, which I think is cool. And certainly continues today. I've been doing my book reviews at WBAA since 1983, when the estimable Roger Priest answered my request that I sent out to all of the media. And Roger Priest said, well, yeah, why don't you come over and we can talk about the library once in a while. He quickly navigated into, he wanted a book review every week from me. So and I've been doing it ever since with 1 year's exception. It's been a grand and wonderful relationship. And I can't wait till your book comes out.
Anytime now. Like
Excellent.
next week.
Excellent. On the many, many years of WBAA. Well, Mrs. Dickey guides the West Lafayette Public Library through the 20s, the 30s, and indeed the early 40s. And what's going on then? West Lafayette is unusual, I think, in some ways, because in the 1930s, West Lafayette's still growing. There's still active residential building going on. Purdue is still a going concern, right? And so Hills and Dale starts in the 1930s, which still astounds me. That neighborhood was planned and was implemented in the height of the Depression. And so the library is still an active going part of the community. We have by the 1930s, the library has taken over or been granted the permission to have the lower level because City Hall moves out to their new facility on North Street next to the fire station. And so the library gets to take over the entire building, which is exciting and offers them yet more space. The kids end up on the second floor, the adults end up on the first floor, and the teens, of course, are wherever the teens are. We never know what to do with teens until the last 20 or 30 years. Libraries have figured out what to do with teenagers, or at least think we know what we're doing with teenagers. But back in the day, the teens, and I have a couple of photos that will make my point for me. I think the teens seem to be kind of wherever their interests may bring them into the library. Mrs. Dickey, as I said, retires in 1941, which it was before World War II actually started for America, the United States. So I don't know that there was anything to do with that. I think she had decided that, well, it's been almost 20 years. Maybe that's long enough to spend on this particular job. And she was of an age when they hired her in the first place, after all. So Florence Grove takes over for 3 years and walks the library basically through World War II. She starts the first intimation that I can find of programming. Public programming was difficult to do in this building, as you can imagine. There's not a lot of space that you can give over to programming. A couple of the photos that I'll show will show that they had book displays and they had National Book Week, they had hoo-ha and that sort of thing. But it is in the early 1940s with Florence Grove that we have our first real public programming mentioned in the library. And that was a book drive to support the soldiers. We were encouraged to bring our books in, drop them, the ones that we didn't want, or that we hopefully actually brought in new stuff. But I want to be realistic. You brought in books, the library collected them, sent them down to Indianapolis, and the Indianapolis folks would send them out to troops, either in country or out of country, so that they would have something to read in their downtime, or just something to remind them of home. Seemed to be, of course, the idea. So Florence Grove runs things for a few years, and Edith Biddle moves in. She is important to the library because she helps provide that bridge between the Dickey years and the Washburn years. She moves and keeps the library going in that post-war 1945 to 1950 era, when Purdue is just exploding, right? All of these vets are coming back, all these GIs are coming back with their GI Bill benefits. Lots of people are moving into town, mainly guys, but some of them are bringing spouses with them. Families start to organize. West Lafayette starts burgeoning in terms of growth, and the West Lafayette Library continues in this exciting little building that was built back in the later part of the 19th century. We get to two more librarians, Valerie Hyatt and Viola Leahy, who take up the work and become an important part of the library history because they kept the library moving forward in the midst of all this tumult, what must have been seemed to folks very tumultuous change. In fact, Mrs. Leahy starts something that I wanted to bring up because it deals with technology and public technology. She purchases the first public use LP record player for the library. So I brought some records just in memory of Viola Leahy. So she, I'm sure they didn't look like this, but these are LP records. She buys the first LP record player, and I love, once again, this is from the minutes. I love how they recorded it. Her reasoning for buying it, and the reason I presume that the library board approved it, because they were still at the point where the library board had to approve all of the stuff. We would have gone to Jeff and said, Jeff, can we please have a record player? And so what does she do? She pulls the kid card. She says, okay, I'm buying it because we need it for the summer reading program. We want to have a music program for kids in the summer. We need a record player if we're going to do that, because, you know, we can borrow yours, but you're going to want it back and blah, 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 blah. So technology takes a leap forward. Not only do we have a telephone, now we have a record player. I don't know what is going on. And one would presume records. I know we still had LP records when I arrived in 1981. We made special provision for them in the 2003-04. If you remember that building, you walked in the front doors. They were on pretty much a wall of records, not too far from the front doors. They were across from the new books, and got a whole lot of use. A very popular collection until they kind of went away, and now they're coming back. Anyway, so records, and then in 1957, drum roll please. There's Mrs. Dickey in her final years, and I threw this in here because it does show where in the world are you going to do programming in here? There's nowhere. It's West Lafayette. You want to have a lot of books for the folks. You want to have pamphlets and magazines. There's the phone. There's nowhere for Mrs. Dickey to do programming. Nonetheless, we have all. We're going back for just a moment here. My apologies. But we do have all of these are clippings from the Journal and Courier and the Lafayette Leader when they actually covered stuff like this, which was wonderful because it makes for great reading in the scrapbooks. I love this one, National Book Week, with special events arranged by Miss Florence Grove. Mrs. Harry Sasmet, library assistant and native Cuban, will talk on life and customs of Cuban groups at Morton school children who visit the library during the week. That's kind of cool. And you'll notice the Victory Reading Club, because everything was based around in the World War II years. Everything was victory this, victory that. The kids could get special stamps on their badges that they got as part of the summer reading program. Obviously, the library really embraced all of that World War II ethos and made it a special part of what the library was providing as well. And here we see, isn't this wonderful? This says several things. I love that it's all these kids with their happy faces looking at the library. We presume that the librarian is up front reading to them, right? This is 1947. It looks 1950s to me, but maybe fashions didn't change all that much, because I remember getting hand-me-downs, not unlike some of this when I was in the 60s. So anyway, this is 1947. The kids are there. You can see the card catalog in the back. You can see the dictionary. I think we still have that dictionary. On the dictionary stand in the back, you can see the books. They're all Caucasian. There's nary a non-white person in there, but they're all obviously, except for this child, everybody seems to be attentive and really fascinated by whatever the librarian is doing. And I do not understand this. The newspaper. In fact, there's one over here too. I don't know if that was a thing that the parents didn't want them sitting on the dirty floor or something. And so the kids kind of sat on the newspaper. It's a precious little artifact from 1947. And then over on the right is the library, a little gussied up, right? That looks a little more like, whoa, we're greeting you here with a little more fanciful architecture as you walk up. Ah, yes, I love this one. This of course, isn't this classic? This is so library. This is like Leave It to Beaver library, right? It's a little older than Leave It to Beaver, but that's my touchstone from my early years. So there we are with the librarian, her lovely assistant, and of course one can imagine the conversation, and I would love to write a novel or a short story just based on what these two were chit-chatting about. It was a 2-page spread in the Journal and Courier, because it was 30 years of public library service. And over here, this young woman is selecting, this is a teenager, she's 13, already wearing the scarf, visits the children's room after school. And just the pictures, I know as history people, you understand where I'm going with this. The pictures truly do have 1,000 words in here. You can talk about all kinds of things from these pictures alone, talking about, well, what life would have been like in West Lafayette at the time. Okay, we'll get to Mrs. Washburn here in a moment. Meanwhile, up here we have some kids. This is the American Book Week. The library had a special display from November 14 to 20, and we actually named the kids because that was okay to do back in the day. Give first name and last name. They're all reading around the table. Here's the one-time fire hall, now houses books at 115 North Chauncey Avenue. Special book displays may be seen during American Book Week. Also, special displays have been set up at the Wells Memorial Library in Lafayette. Emphasis is placed on kids' books because we want kids to read. And indeed, if we get kids to read, they do tend to come back as teenagers and then, of course, as adults. The building's looking a little better to me. I don't know what, this is black and white. It's still pretty darn nondescript in the front. I mean, that's very utilitarian to me. It's not, there's no tubs of anything outside, but the building's been painted or whitewashed. It's got some trim on it. So it's things are moving a little bit along, and it is 1954. We're post World War II here. Okay, the Washburn years. Lucille is I was going to say married, is brought into the library in 1957. She is the first Masters of Library Science librarian that West Lafayette gets. And you do see things begin to change, become a little more forward moving as soon as she hits town. Here we are in 1958. This is National Book Week again, because National Book Week. West Lafayette Public Library's display on space travel, set up in connection with National Book Week, includes 6 live participants hidden under helmets, goggles, and other items. And again, we give the kids names because why not? And this is just so wonderful, right? This is so, it's the space age. Sputnik went up, what, a year before this in 1950? It would have gone up in 57. Anyway, everybody's, the Russians are going to take over space. And so America starts this big space program under Eisenhower, comes to fulfillment, Nixon, Johnson, Kennedy, or I'm sorry, wrong on that one, right? Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon. Anyway, here's the library grabbing hold of that space age idea and doing something. Meanwhile, over here, Mrs. Horace Tyler, a member of the West Lafayette Story Art Club, reads from a book at one of the library's story hours, which will continue every day from 1:30 to 2 through July 21st. So summer reading club becomes continues to be an ongoing thing. Book fairs. Does anyone remember the first book fair? Back in 1959 in the, correct me if I'm wrong in any of this, what I've been saying. 1959, the first book fair happens in the parking lot of Morton School in the back. It's run by the new Friends of the West Lafayette Public Library. By the time I got here, it had moved from the Morton School parking lot because I think it was just too big. By the 1960s, and certainly well into the 80s and 90s, we were holding it in spring and again in fall in the gyms of Happy Hollow, Birchfield, and Cumberland. I'm sure many of you took part in the book fair. It was a true community event, because not only did the Lauterbachs and the Ulrichs and several other people collect all of this stuff in the library, sort through it, break it into categories, box it up, and then the West Lafayette Parks and Rec, or no, it was the street department. The West Lafayette Street Department would come and load them onto a truck, take them to the school, unload them, and then we, the wonderful community volunteers, would go and jockey them around on our dollies, put them on tables. Everybody in the community would come in, select stuff. There'd be lots of fun and greeting. It was kind of a neighborhood block party or a citywide block party twice a year. And just a wonderful experience. And then at the end, does anyone know what we did with them at the end? Because we just truly did not have room to take them back to the library. So Don Gray, Nick Schenkel, and a few other people loaded them onto trucks. We drove them down to 2nd Street in Lafayette. And if you remember, there was a big paper mulching. It was on 2nd Street, this big paper mulching kind of thing. And we threw boxes of, I know, I still, it's like a church, Joe. I still have little moments of fear that I'm going to get retribution for this. We would throw the boxes in, and it was very cathartic, because after all of that big weekend of setting it up on Friday and then having people come in and ask and be so excited Saturday and Sunday, what didn't sell, we couldn't do anything else with it at the time. We took it down and it became cardboard boxes for somebody somewhere in the country. So things have changed. Now that we have the book fairs in the library, and now we actually have a book sale room in the basement, which is really cool. And hopefully you'll come on Saturday and see it. Although we're open Tuesday, Thursday, Saturdays right now. Now, if the books don't sell, we send them off to a book jobber, and we actually get a little cash based on pound, which I think is fascinating. But they do have a life, even if they don't sell for us. They do have a life after us, which is cool. But the book fairs are such a West Lafayette library tradition, and such an appreciated part of our history, that I had to throw in a slide about them. 1961, 62, Lucille and the board decide that it's about time to pull the trigger. Let's actually build a new library. We build a new library. This is the, which we have to put up in the new building right now. This is the plaque with all the board members' names and Lucille's name. And you'll notice that Walter Scholler did the building, that Kemmer Construction was responsible for the construction of it. Erected in 1961. I was mentioning to our esteemed director here at TCHA, the building looks very 60s to me, as this building looks very 60s to me. This is a little earlier than this building, but still brick, sleek for its day, right? This is where this was actually blocking off some outdoor exhaust and HVAC stuff. And the parking was over here. And in the back, this is Columbia Street. You can tell by the cars more or less what the age is. It served the community from 1961 for quite a while. Here's Lucille, wonderful picture of her at the front desk greeting people. This is the classic West Lafayette Public Library photo from the early 1960s. It looked like this when I came in 1981, except it was a lot more cluttered. But pretty much that was it. And when we remodeled in 03, 04, we largely kept the circulation desk where it was. My office got put back here, and that door stayed until we tore the building down in 04. That's a there are parts of this building that did not really change from 1961 until '04, served the community incredibly well, of course. And here you see Lucille with her, it's expanding. We have more than just a music, more than just a phonograph record. We now have the headphones, and we have kids who are obviously thrilled to be there, experiencing the music. Because we have a bigger building, we can now do programming. We can now do displays. And so the GNC picks up on that with old carbolets are on display at the library. The Yuletide Reader, this is a program that they had for kids. The suffragettes come and talk at the library. The author visits become a real thing. And here we have a couple of local gentlemen who are discussing their book that was made for the public. And this wonderful little thing, those little odd displays that libraries and museums put up, these are teeny tiny shoes, as I hope you can see, that were on display. And it made the JNC with a picture, for heaven's sake. So yay community involvement, right? Then 1968, a huge change comes for the library that will kind of tumble down into the years. Bertha Jane Moffett, I found this wonderful photo of her as a young child, a fascinating person, right? Fascinating local personality. Is a very early woman graduate of Purdue University in 1903, goes back and gets a master's degree as a woman in the early 1900s, gets it in entomology, becomes her husband, she never marries, becomes her father's office person, Dr. William Moffett, who was a big name locally in the medical field, both in West Lafayette and in Tippecanoe County. Anyway, when she passes away, she gives $190,000 from her estate to the library. That's the biggest gift that we ever received up to that time. Huge impact. And the library board and Mrs. Washburn spend the next basically couple decades trying to decide what in the world to do with that money. Once again, we mark the 50th year. Lucille retires in 1981. She looks really happy in that photo. I'm glad for her. That's really cool. And that's a really cool photo of her. I think it's really a nice one. The library hires this wacky new young guy. I'm 27 years old in this photo. It's a Frank Oliver photo. It's the first time I ever met Frank Oliver. He was very gracious and said, well, let's put you in front of, they still say that, right? When they take my photo, they still want to do it in front of books, which I just, that's so cool. Personal note, I love that jacket. I wish I had never thrown it out. It's a green tweed jacket. Back in the 70s, it was really styling. But there I am in 1981, hired these three people more than, and I really want to give credit to these two, really made the West Lafayette Library what it is. I've been fortunate to be there for a number of years, but Mrs. Dickey and Mrs. Washburn really made that library what it was. I remember complimenting the board as only a 27-year-old can do, right? On the wonderful collection that I found there. It really was a superb collection. And I remember being like blown away that this small public library had that kind of book and audiovisual collection. Anyway, when Mrs. Washburn retires, there's a financial challenge. I do not blame Lucille one moment for it, but it happened to be a bad situation for the library. The library board had, in their generosity, had decided they wouldn't raise taxes, which was a great moral, probably, victory. Financially, it devastated us. I arrived in September, there was no book budget left. They hired me, they didn't tell me that either, by the way. They hired me, brought me in from beautiful Connorsville and said, well, really glad you're here. We don't have any money, but really glad you're here. So have fun. They had started a volunteer program that became the talk of the town. We had some fantastic, truly fantastic volunteers from Purdue, retired Purdue folks, Purdue spouses when that was still a thing, right? And lots of just kind of townies who came in and volunteered for the library. They were evidently quite taken with me, I'm happy to say. And I got some very good natured ribbing from a number of those volunteers who I still remember. Does anyone remember Vi Hall? Another anecdotal moment here. Vi Hall lived on Sugar Hill Drive, just outside of West Lafayette. And I still remember one day she walked in and said, "Okay, what have you changed today? Because I know you've changed something." And that, because I was in my 20s, right? I was 20s, 30s, it was like, "Oh, well, let's do this, let's do that." And God bless her, they all went along with it. They all just went with the flow. We had a fantastic library program. And then in 1980, as Jeff alluded to, in 83, 84, the Moffett money gets invested in building a new addition to the library. This is the Moffett Room, that Moffett meeting room area back here. The library also expands out the back. So we basically doubled the size of the 1961-62 library. We unfortunately bring down the church that was across the street, put in a flat parking lot with a fence, still remember that fence, and off we go. We're off to the races. Things are really happening once again. 2003, 2004, I convinced the board, didn't need a whole lot of convincing, but I convinced the board that the boiler, which dates from 1961, just was not going to hack it anymore. Something had to happen. The board, as boards will do, if you've served on the board or you've been associated with the board, well, if we're going to replace the boiler, then we should probably talk about maybe we should do a little addition here or something. Maybe that would be a good idea to do. So they hire an architect, and there you go. And now we're off to the races again. The library board, and I certainly supported it, decided they would tear down the existing 1961-2003 building and build a brand new building in its place. So what the library does, besides getting into the JNC on the front page of the local live section, we moved the staff into Pete's bar, which we remodeled as an adult collection library. We move the tech processing, the behind the scenes folks move into the dentist building, which is just north of the library. You can see the new library here. And we move the kids and programming into what was then Morton Center. The city was exceptionally generous. I think they gave us more, they let us use much of the first floor of Morton Center for like $1 a year. It was a great deal. We also brought in a lot of electricity. We brought in a lot more wiring for them, brought in new internet for them, which they really didn't have before. The 203-04 building, in fact, builds on that relationship between the library and the city. As we were building this new building, they decided, well, if we're going to build a new library, then maybe we should work on some of the streetscape in the area. They tear up the streets, not unlike today, and put in new sewer systems and all that kind of exciting, important infrastructure. We bring in fiber for the first time, not only to the library, but to Morton Center as well, and to much of that part of West Lafayette. And I'm still proud that we managed to be a part of that whole kind of rejuvenation of what becomes downtown. The building is the current building that was built in 03-04, just expanded this year, is an homage to Louis Sullivan. And I found a picture of the old Louis Sullivan Bank before that ATM got built there. This, of course, those of you who know Louis Sullivan know that he was a famed national, international architect. By the time he was building these jewel box banks across the Midwest, he had fallen on hard times, but he still produced these really beautiful buildings. The current library has picked up on a lot of the terracotta designs, and we incorporated that into our building. And of course, Samara in Hills and Dales, the beautiful Frank Lloyd Wright Usonian home is reflected in the library with the idea of the light, bringing the outdoors in, big open spaces that are very convertible. We didn't go with the color scheme. That's a Samara color scheme, and God bless them. There it is, the new library lit up at night. This was before drones. So this was taken, we're not quite sure where this was taken. But this is a wonderful photo of the library at night with our two entrances, one on Columbia, one on Chauncey. This huge, beautiful space up here, still my favorite part of the library. And definitely an homage up there to Frank Lloyd Wright and his work. The new library works really well. We have this wonderful esplanade on Northwestern Avenue. Here on the right, you can see Record Store Day, which became quite a thing back in the late 2000s or the 2010s, actually. It was April. For some reason, it's in April every year. And so you can see not everything is foliaged out, but people were showing up. We had a beer tent that I know some of our board members enjoyed. And we had live music from local bands. It was a fantastic event. We brought in help from J&O Records and from Bonds and from other folks from the Tippecanoe Arts Federation. It was a happening event and all ages, which is really cool. Everyone from little toddlers running around. In fact, sometimes they would be dancing in front of the performers, up through older folks who came just to enjoy the music and the fun and the festivities. Wanted to mention a couple more community things. The community quilt that we have rehung. This is made of, these are made of quilt squares that were individually fashioned by members of the community. There's a list of everyone who contributed. And then Anastasia Kurtulis, who at the time was our head reference librarian. She's now the head of the library board. Anastasia stitched it all together and made that wonderful production, which we put up in 2004 and has been there, has a new home now, but is still on the second floor. We're very happy to have it. Craig Martin did a fantastic mural, children's literature mural out on the plaza area that is no more. But we've memorialized it through photos at least, and it really was. It was fascinating to watch the number of people who would come and get photographed against that mural. Just blew me away because my office was right here, so I could look out on the mural. People of all ages, especially college-age kids, would come and get their photograph taken in front of the mural. So tells us something. It was a beautiful production. Wanted to mention the technology updates. Of course, I think that's an old Mac. Am I correct? An old Mac computer, and we didn't actually start with Mac computers back in the day. So we automated the library. We automated the library largely because of another gift from Marjorie Zumstein, who was a librarian at Purdue, left a significant amount of her estate to the library. And the library board decided, well, let's automate the library. Let's actually jump into the computer age. So this is one of the few remaining ones that we have from our CLSI computer system. There's a PDP 1173, I believe. Does that sound? Because I remember the hair guy coming and he was a hoot. So now, of course, we've moved into the computer age. DVDs became a thing and they still are very popular, surprising to some people. And finally, what is the future? The future is many things. It is certainly behind Terry Tyler. You can see that says New York Times bestseller because books are still exceptionally popular with our populace. I think some of me thinks that it helps that Purdue and even the school libraries are moving away from print books and moving into ebooks. We are the big purveyor, as well as GCPL. We are now the big purveyors of print, and print remains very, very popular. If you have any doubts, come in and watch the kids area for just a few minutes. It's amazing how many kids are checking out, stacks of books just like they always did. Libby, of course, is the online service. We are now part of a statewide consortium. Thank you, State Library, where almost every public library in the state, we all share our electronic books and our electronic audio books as well. And so it's made for a huge collection. We're a member of Evergreen, Indiana. If you live in West Lafayette, you get the classic green card. If you live outside of West Lafayette, we're still happy to serve you, just as we did in the 1920s. We'll give you a blue card. Evergreen, Indiana offers you the opportunity to select from about 6 million different books DVDs and other materials that we ship around the state. Again, thank you, State Library. Our tax dollars at work. It's a wonderful service. It means that you can get books from Zionsville, you can get them from Seymour, you might get them from Pogue Library, you might get them from our newest members up in the northern part of the state. It's a wonderful cooperative service, and we're very proud to be a part of that. And with libraries literally aren't just a place to obtain books for free, although we are that. They're one of the few public spaces left in our society we are allowed to exist without the expectation of spending money, which is fantastic. And we are so happy we can continue that for this community and for generations, I'm sure, yet to come. So that's my presentation. I appreciate your staying for it. If you have questions, please ask them. I'll be glad to respond. And I did bring scrapbooks. The original scrapbook here is from 1921 to 1962, which is exactly what you would think it is, full of wonderful old clippings and photographs and things that were going on. And then the newer one takes us into the 03-04 period, when so much was changing with the library and with the expansion and the decision to stay where we did and all kinds of other nifty, cool stuff and the big grand opening that we had then. Hope you can come Saturday. We will have our grand reopening of the public library. Gathering starts at 1. We'll have the speeches and the ribbon cutting at 1:45, and then the library building opens with guided tours and passports and all kinds of exciting things at 2. Be glad to have it's as is usual. It's free. We're even going to have shaved ice for free. So if you like shaved ice with, with flavoring, although who doesn't love shaved ice with flavoring? We'll have. They will be there. We'll have the West Lafayette High School marching band will be there to play some tunes and to lead us into the library once the ribbon is cut. So, and then we'll have some programming inside as well. It should be a fun event. And we will have we won't be taping the whole thing, but we'll have some video taken of it as well, so we can share it with everyone afterwards. So thank you very much. Thanks for listening to me. Thanks for the information.